Sky Island Alliance out of Tucson and currently work for them on a part-time basis doing their protected areas strategy work on wilderness and other protected areas and special area designations. So Sky Island Alliance is, as I said, an organization. That's our website. You can always get in touch with us through that website, and you can get in touch with me by going to that website if you have any questions afterwards and we don't have time, or if you have questions or want to talk, feel free. So this is Sky Island, a little bit of organizational structure here. We came out of the sort of the early movement of the Society for Conservation Biology interest in trying to implement conservation biology on the ground and using small regional focused organizations to do that kind of implementation work. So we'll talk a little bit about that and a little bit about what really makes this area super special. So the Sky Islands, what they are, why they're special, a little bit about the conservation biology, and how, hopefully how, we weave that into our everyday work at the Alliance. Sky Island region, of course, many of you know, but it's essentially the southeastern part of Arizona, the boot heel of New Mexico, and much of the northwestern part of Sonora, Mexico. It's the basin and range region of this area, and the Sky Islands, of course, are these mountain ranges that are surrounded by desert seas, grasslands and desert seas, mountains that pop up and create an amazing level of diversity. And from the bottom of these mountains, you can rise up essentially through the desert, the thorn scrub, the semi-desert, up in through the oak woodland. And when you get up on top of the mountains, if those of you who've ever been up on, say, Mount Graham, would know that at 10,000 feet, you'd think you were in Colorado. And in effect, if you're looking latitudinally, you're really moving from the deserts to the Canadian boreal forest. If you were, only you can do it just by going vertically up the mountainsides. So we have the lower elevations and a suite of species that are out there on the lower elevations, the mid-elevation thorn scrub country, and the higher elevation oak woodlands, up into the pine oak forest and the high elevations, and up to the very top in the southern part in Mexico, into the Madrone forest, and here in the northern part here in southeastern Arizona, the Douglas fir component forest. A little bit of white fir, some spruce, all kinds of amazing places. This is a place that is beyond description as far as the biological diversity. It's one of the most diverse places on the planet, southeastern Arizona. It's a 70,000 square miles area. I think I already said it's one of the most diverse places on the planet. Getting ahead of myself as usual. It's where major deserts and major forest biological provinces come together, including the neotropics, the Sierra Madre, some of the Great Plains influence, the Chihuahuan Desert influence, the Rocky Mountains and the Sonoran Desert influence, all come together. So all of this on a horizontal level of diversity that is unparalleled in most parts of the world. And then you add to that elevational gradient, which gives you the high elevation, not only the horizontal diversity, but also elevational gradient and vertical diversity, making it an amazing spot, one of the world biodiversity hotspots. We've got some 404 mammal species in this neck of the woods, some amazingly beautiful critters. Over half the bird species in North America live in the Sky Island region. 3,000 or plus plants, some of which are just beyond description and are amazing. Everything from the lower elevation species to the columbine, which is the Colorado state flower, I believe. As 117 reptile species, 26 amphibians, and countless arachnids and insects, which are just almost off the scale as far as the insect fauna, and everything from bees to ants to moths to you name it, they're incredible. But unfortunately, of course, as we all know, these areas are all under pressure. All of this landscape is under pressure, and it's burgeoning pressure. It's population growth, and population growth, in effect, is leading to areas that are being subdivided, extensions of the urban area out into previously wild places and or places where wildlife habitat is what's really the ultimate value in the southeastern part of the state and in northern Mexico. Northern Mexico has one thing over us: they don't have a lot of urban areas that are expanding into those areas. So that program is really pretty fascinating, finding all kinds of interesting creatures. But this habitat issue where it's fragmenting or changing the habitat radically throughout the Southwest, and increased energy put into and demand for recreation associated with that increased population. It creates incredible habitat fragmentation on the land, on the landscape, and we've all seen this out there on the land, and how this, in effect, will impact our wildlife species is the bottom line for Sky Island Alliance. Big mining operations. We're very involved in the Rosemont mine issue right now, and in a variety of other issues that are on the landscape, especially associated with large mining operations. The cost of the commodity interests, the cost of minerals has gone up, and so a lot of old mines are now being reevaluated for their values in today's market. And then there's geopolitical issues and issues associated with, in this case, the border wall, the border fence, and how that might impact wildlife is another issue that is really on our radar. And climate change, the increase in fires, I think it was mentioned, I think John Raines mentioned it earlier, that we all know that these fires are increasing in intensity and in frequency, and for a variety of reasons, and we're probably going to be facing many more of that. So these are all issues, along with climate change, are all issues. I was a ranger in Death Valley, and this was a rare photo that I took back in 1976. And you know, I've been looking for that critter since in Death Valley, but it didn't make it, I'm afraid. So, and I'm also, one thing that I want you to know is that we're an organization, or organizations in the environmental community, that sometimes has to face a lot of biases that when we're trying to, all of us, all the students in here, everybody that deals in this kind of work has to face, to a certain extent, mythology and cultural icons and cultural norms that influence the way that we get our work done every single day. I'm from Douglas, Wyoming, and Douglas is the home of the jackalope. And for 60 years, I've been looking for one of those things, and yet to find it. But I know it's out there, because in the West, by God, those myths are reality. And all you got to do is ask any cattleman, and they'll tell you that. So one of the things for all of those issues and all the things that we face out there are, you know, what is that answer out there? Well, we've looked at the idea of applying conservation biology to wildlife corridors and habitat cores. And so applying this conservation biology on the land, the one thing that I want to make sure everybody knows is that we are not necessarily in support of reestablishing Pleistocene wildlife. I personally am very informed. We are very, very good on that. I would love to see it. I think that if the cattlemen on the land today have an issue with wolves and jaguars and mountain lions, imagine what they do with a smilodon or a cave bear or something along those lines. And the other thing is, we're not planning to bring immediately any animals back from Africa in order to try to supplement and reestablish habitat. These are things that sometimes you hear all the time. I mean, it's amazing. You'll hear this stuff. They're going to bring animals back from Africa, and it's going to be, you know, we're going to have traditional old horses or something on the landscape, or giraffes. Although that might be, giraffes might do a number on the mesquite population. So it might not be a bad idea. One thing we are definitely a group that's interested in trying to make sure that the connections across the landscape remain connections across the landscape. And we do it by getting out there, getting that data. We heard a lot about accumulating data and how that is impossibly important for what we end up doing. So we do that, we end up getting, it's great, because you get dirty, you get to do 14-hour days in the Gila Mountains like I did just last week, and I'm still paying the price for that. You're getting involved, and you get a lot of people that go out and help you. But the basis has to be a model, and you have to use a model to frame the kind of data that you want. And the model that we use is a conservation biology, very simplified idea of conservation biology, creating cores, using multiple use buffer zones around those cores, and connecting those core areas with habitat. And it's everything from the small predators. These guys are not. These guys aren't the ones that are a major concern on the landscape. These guys are very adaptable, as we all know. They're probably running around this campus, as perhaps are these folks. But they are out there. They're on the landscape. They're those mesopredators that come out when the big guys are taken out. And unfortunately, those big guys have been taken out of our landscape. That's a jaguar. It was killed in near the Rincon Mountains. The grizzly bear was once here, extant within this, very close to Tucson, probably within 20 or 30 miles of Tucson. There had grizzly bear sightings and habitat back in the old days. Not necessarily that we're advocating bringing grizzly bears back. Well, I'm not sure the poor grizzly from Idaho would do real well back in the Southwest without having somebody to train it and how to survive. But the wolf, we know the wolf is back on the landscape, and this is something that we're very involved in wolf protection, and also in trying to protect and create habitat that will enhance wolves, enhance the jaguar, and the ability of the jaguar to move around. And that's where we get in trouble with the modern day cowboy. This is my neighbor on a little plot of land that I have an interest in Colorado, and they were out rounding up cows that day, and I looked again, and I realized they're rounding up and separating out their cows, and they were doing it all on an ATV. And I thought, whoa, that's pretty amazing. And then I looked down there, and there was one poor cowboy who was down in the riparian area trying to pull cows out of the riparian area on horseback. He was the only one that had a horse out on that whole thing. The times are changing for the cattle industry, and for the cattlemen and for the livestock industry. And those critters right there on the landscape do come into some conflict with our operations. And we try to figure out the best way to deal with some of those. Sometimes we have to be obstructionist, sometimes we have to sit down in long meetings, sometimes we go to the Malpai Borderlands board meeting group, and there are a variety of strategies that we're in use in. But the one thing that I will say is I did work in Yellowstone National Park, and I don't care who tells you what about the surrogate animals on the wildland landscape, but that is not that. Cows are not bison. They're not even in the same world. If you've ever dealt with bison, you know that a cow is not a surrogate on the landscape for bison. There's just no way around it. So building those cores and building those buffer zones, and that's kind of just a model that we use, those interregional corridors connecting to the landscape, you create this kind of habitat that is similar to islands in an ocean. And we have islands in deserts. And so the same kind of models, the same kind of theoretical models about what happens on islands and oceans can happen on islands in the deserts. So it's how that diversity has evolved over time. But oceans are scary places, and especially if you're not an animal that doesn't normally cross oceans. If you live on land on a high peak and you need habitat and cover, it's tough to get from peak to peak if you want to go find a mate. So across the landscape, what we do is we look at corridors and wildlife corridors and the landscape. And this is some of the very rough work that has been done down in the southeastern part of the state. But the interesting thing is, of course, recognizing that we're moving across borders. There are no boundaries on wildlife on borders. They don't recognize political boundaries. They do recognize border fences, and that fence has become a real issue for us, and especially as it impacts wildlife movement across the border. It's not just the fence, but it's all the infrastructure that goes with it. The lights, the increased traffic, all of those kinds of things have an impact. But we also work closely with the city and with the county to establish biological corridors. All of these things are those connected pieces that are looking at the landscape and how we can connect them, including even overpasses and working with the state ADOT in this case to establish new overpasses on roads that are out there. And it really goes to this whole concept, the conservation biology concept of metapopulation dynamics, that if you have those connected cores, those round circles, and there's opportunities for creatures to move from point A, from circle to circle, and reestablish populations, reestablish the genetic material that needs to be, that they need to flourish as a population, then that's the kind of landscape we'd like to see out there, and the kind of landscape that we're working to create. If they're segregated and separated, that population has a major chance of blinking out and no longer being extant and support. So we do that through building those corridors, and through my project, which is the Wilderness and Protected Lands Core Areas. We've done, one of the things that is always interesting to look at is that most of our protected areas, just for your own information, think about it, most of our protected areas are in high elevation mountains, areas nobody wanted. They may not have a lot of water, they don't have timber resources, they're hard to mine, a variety of different reasons. So they pick and they cherry pick the tops of the mountains and created wilderness areas out of those tops of the mountains. And everybody was fine with that, but it doesn't work when you need animals that move from mountain range to mountain range and across the landscape. And so we get out there, we do that kind of work, and we come up with plans like the Tumacacri Highlands Wilderness. The other thing that we do is to try to do wildlife tracking. A lot of our work, in fact, all of our work involving wildlife is what I would call non-invasive techniques. So we use tracking counts. We get out and we actually have people that adopt track routes. We also do trigger photography and come up with some amazing things, working in this case in Mexico with our ranching community down there. That's the eastbound end of a westbound ocelot, and was the first photo taken of an ocelot in the United States ever taken of it, and that was taken on one of our cameras. And since then, we've had both ocelot and jaguars seen throughout this. This is an ocelot from down just about 30 miles south of the border, south of the San Pedro, and that is an area where the animal is actually breeding. That's the closest breeding population. As far as the jaguar goes, we get photos of jaguars. We've had them within 15 miles of Tucson, urban Tucson, and it's amazing. But the best of our knowledge, there are no breeding populations. So the concept of edge effect comes into this, and how do we create cores that are large enough to effectively support animals in one block of land, in a landscape that's so fragmented by what we have left on the landscape. And that's where developing those cores and then trying to figure out how to link them together. And so A would be a perfect scenario. B works if you can link it up. C doesn't work because any animal that needs interior cover and support from, say, a large forested area or high elevation, if it's fragmented to that point, they lose it, you know, and there are multiple studies out there, many of them looking at elk and how road density and how that affects elk. So we get out, we do a lot of restoration work as well. This is where we do a little bit of work on wildcat roads and that sort of thing. That's a rodent area, an old rodent area that we're in the process of restoring. This is one of the things that we've been trying to work with the ranching community on, and that's to make wildlife-friendly, habitat-friendly fencing, to actually clear some of those fences, even in places where there are still cattle. And this is a low strands taken off for pronghorn habitat. Pronghorn movement across the landscape. And pronghorn, as you know, will go under a fence, but they won't jump a fence, whereas a deer will jump if they can clear it. Sometimes that doesn't happen. One of the other things is that's a cattle exclosure. Yes, that's a cattle exclosure on the Coronado National Forest. And, clearly not adequate to address the issues on that allotment. So that we're really looking at things, and we're really looking at trying to extend those and work with the agency and others to try to do it. We do a lot of riparian restoration, and that we also are working a lot on trying to make sure that the cattle industry, livestock industry recognizes that it's maybe not a real good idea to try to put supplements down in riparian areas. And that if we're trying to keep the cattle out of riparian areas, and in some cases the cattlemen are for that, and then turn around. This was an area on the forest that they brought us out to look at the riparian area and what the values of moving the cattle out, and they had put their supplement back in the edge of the riparian area. So it just brought the cows right back into the whole area. This is typical of a spring area that's been rocked and in this case for erosion, but we're also looking at springs that have been captured, and then that water goes into cattle operations. And one of the things that we've got a process in place to do is to look at those springs, to reevaluate those springs, to go in and to revegetate and restore those springs so that they're wildlife friendly. And if need be, many of them are no longer even operating cattle tanks. I mean, they're not used. If need be, to figure out a way to get the cattle and the wildlife to be able to access those springs and create things. And then another one is looking out across the landscape. We look at all that and we think, man, that's just a spectacular landscape. It looks so good. What we really don't understand, or what we're really not facing, is the idea that that landscape is it's Leopold's statement that the more you learn, paraphrase, the more you learn about ecology, the more you live, the more you recognize that you live in a world of wounds. And we can look at that, and this is exactly what I think a couple of the other speakers have said. You can look out there and look across that, but you need to go out there and actually know what's on that landscape, because much of that may in fact be an invasive grass, may in fact be African grasses, may be or Asian grasses or Russian, and so it's a hard one to do. So I just want to finish up, tell you what we did, how we're dealing a little bit, but also to recognize that that this landscape is an intricate and amazing place. One of the stories I need to tell you is a friend of mine was with the Nature Conservancy in Wyoming. And they have a lot of ranches, the Nature Conservancy in Wyoming. You may not know that, but they are very invested in the ranching business in Wyoming and in Idaho and other places. And the ranch manager was out. His friend's a PhD in ecology, entomology. And he was out, and for months and months, the rancher had been telling him, get rid of these. We need to change this particular plant because nothing eats it. Cattle don't eat it, sheep don't eat it, elk don't eat it. It's not good for anything. It's nothing. Well, one day Jerry took his net and he went out and he just swooshed through the plant community, and he just had billions of different bugs. And he grabbed it and he wrapped it up and he went back and he just said, Bob, look at this. It's not all about your goddamn cattle. And Bob, and whether a cow will eat it or not, it's all a part of a system, and it goes from this small, amazing system, and these intricate, beautiful, incredible plants to all the way up. And we need to think about all of that system as we decide how to manage that landscape. And so that's how you can stay in tune. And please feel free to get in touch with us. Go to our website, and that's it. Oh, last thing. Remember the nature, you remember the nature bats last slide? Somebody already mentioned that nature bats last. Well, it's true. Nature always bats last. And this is apropos for our, especially for Phoenix area, for those of you who know the story. Thank you.